opens the door to controlling central space and developing the queen's bishop swiftly. Establishing a solid central pawn structure, e6 prepares to develop pieces with a clear plan, albeit slightly limiting kingside mobility initially. Establishing a solid central presence while preparing for kingside development. Unleashing central pawn tension immediately, black seizes space and opens diagonals for their bishops. Asserting central influence, this pawn push intensifies the struggle for control and prepares further development. Immediately contesting the center with c5 injects dynamic tension, challenging white's pawn structure and opening lines for black's pieces. Clearing the central file now opens a clear line for your queen to influence the queenside pawn majority. Reclaiming the center with the d5 pawn solidifies black's pawn structure and opens lines for piece development. Developing the knight to a natural square, this piece now eyes the central dark squares and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Unifying pieces around the center solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares for a flexible middle game battle. Solidifying central pawns and preparing development, white aims for harmonious piece placement. Unleashing a pawn to seize territory, black immediately challenges white's central control. Developing the bishop towards the center, preparing for castling and reinforcing the d4 pawn's defense. Unlocking the queenside, this bishop actively challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares for a potential queenside pawn storm. Castling shores up the king's safety while connecting the rooks for future action. The knight's journey to e7 aims to reinforce the d5 pawn and prepare for potential pawn breaks. Unleashing a central pawn thrust, white aims to seize initiative and disrupt black's queenside structure, potentially opening lines for attack. Opening the central files like this invites a sharp response and potentially weakens your king's cover. Seizing the center with this knight, exchange aims to dismantle black's advanced pawn chain. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. Securing the king's position now allows for future piece development with greater peace of mind. Opening the c-file grants white pressure on black's queenside pawns. Activating the bishop to pin the knight and challenge white's central pawn structure. Challenging black's aggressive pawn advance, this creates space and forces an immediate decision about the outpost. Seeking to reroute the bishop and evade pawn pressure, this maneuver subtly influences the a5-d8 diagonal. Relocating the bishop aims to protect the d4 pawn and prepare for queenside expansion, but risks weakening the kingside slightly. Reclaiming central space is crucial, but this retreats the bishop to a less active square, surrendering initiative. Provoking black's bishop, this creates a pawn chain that could offer white a useful shelter or a launchpad for further pawn advances. Sacrificing the bishop opens a vital diagonal for black's queen, potentially exploiting white's slightly exposed king. Unlocking the queenside majority, white bravely asserts central control and eyes potential pawn storms. Boldly challenging the center, this piece redistribution immediately ignites a tactical skirmish, forcing white to carefully evaluate material and piece activity. Disrupting black's pawn chain, while creating mating threats on the kingside, demands immediate attention. Unleashing the knight to f5 creates a dangerous fork and threatens to disrupt white's central structure. Targeting the e6 pawn creates immediate pressure, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and opening lines for attack. Shifting the queen to d7 aims to connect the rooks and potentially prepare an e-pawn advance, while also defending against immediate threats. A bold regrouping, sacrificing tempo to pressure the f-pawn and potentially open lines toward the black king. A prudent retreat, securing the king and preparing to reroute the knight for better defense or counterplay. Seizing the open file is a prime objective, aiming to activate the rook and pressure black's queenside. Seeking central control, black shifts the queen to press on the queenside pawn structure. Reclaiming the center and activating the queen's knight offers white improved piece mobility and central control. Reclaiming the open files is paramount, and this knight repositions to support central counterplay and prepare for potential kingside action. Securing the bishop on b1 anticipates potential tactical lines and offers the rook a clear path to central control. A bold centralization of the queen, immediately contesting the open files and challenging white's rook on the d-file. Bringing the rook to the central open file reclaims control and supports the knight's potential advance. Refocusing defensive resources, the queen relinquishes the precarious central outpost for a safer, albeit less active, diagonal. Initiating a daring knight sortie to dominate the crucial d5 square. This defensive maneuver grants the knight breathing room, but neglects developing the kingside. Clearing the knight opens tactical possibilities and targets black's vulnerable d-pawn. Reclaiming the b-file with the pawn immediately opens lines for your rook and resolves the cramped queenside. This bishop's repositioning aims to exert pressure along the now open a2-g8 diagonal, creating dynamic possibilities. Exchanging rooks opens lines and simplifies the position, a prudent decision given the tangled central pawn structure. Reclaiming the open file, white activates their rook, eyeing the now exposed king and creating dynamic play. Shifting the rook to the d-file aims to contest it, potentially preparing for exchanges that simplify the board. Initiating a patient repositioning, this square now becomes a launching pad for future pressure on the queenside. Shifting the queen to defend the pawn creates a potential for a queenside pawn storm, but sacrifices immediate central pressure. Pivoting the queen to a more active central square immediately threatens to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure. Dislodging that knight from d5 disrupts white's coordination and opens lines for counterplay. Shifting pressure to the queenside, this offers a simpler endgame by forcing exchanges. This pawn advance aims to disrupt white's coordination and create potential outposts for black's pieces. Consolidating the king's safety appears paramount as black's queenside pressure mounts. Focusing on king's safety, this retreat prepares to bolster the defensive structure and potentially activate the rook on the back rank. Opening the e-file and directly challenging black's queen creates immediate tension and potential for tactical fireworks. Securing the f1 square with the queen creates an immediate threat to the rook on e1. Sacrificing material to disrupt the enemy's pawn structure creates lasting weaknesses for black. Introducing a knight to the central action, this redeployment aims to disrupt white's coordination and potentially fork pieces. Unleashing a decisive fork, this check directly exploits the exposed king, forcing a favorable exchange or immediate material gain. The black king's shelter appears compromised. This retreat might be a desperate attempt to escape immediate danger. Recapturing the knight opens lines, potentially exposing the black king to discovered threats. Trading queens now leads to a stark endgame where white's active rook, an advanced pawn on the 7th rank, will exert immense pressure. Seizing the passed pawn creates an immediate endgame advantage and opens vital attacking lines.